£40,000. That was the number written on the contract, and not one person in the room thought to ask if it was fair. Not her stepmother, who signed it before the ink had time to dry. Not the solicitor, who had seen enough of these arrangements to stop feeling anything about them. And certainly not the groom, who wasn't even in the city to object. Eleanor Hartley was 23 years old, and she had just been priced like livestock at auction. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood very still in the corner of her stepmother's drawing room and did the only thing she'd learned to do in 9 years under that roof. She made herself invisible, and she waited to find out what was going to happen to her body. What she didn't know yet was that 600 miles north, in a half-burned castle nobody in London would speak of by name, a man was waiting for her specifically, not for a bride, not for an heir, for her. And the reason would take almost a year to surface. But when it did, it would undo everything Eleanor thought she understood about the day she was sold. The drawing room at Hartley House smelled like her stepmother always insisted on smelling. Orange water and old money, even though the money hadn't been old or present in over a year. Lady Constance Hartley did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She kept a small ledger bound in green leather where she recorded the cost of raising Eleanor down to the shilling. The boots, the doctor's visits, even a chipped teacup Eleanor had broken at age 11. And she had shown it to Eleanor exactly once, 3 years ago, the way another woman might show a daughter a portrait of her own mother. It wasn't cruelty to Constance, it was accounting. She genuinely did not understand why Eleanor had cried. "The Duke of Ashgrove has agreed to clear your father's remaining debts," Constance said, not looking up from her correspondence. "In exchange, you'll marry him by proxy this week and travel north within the fortnight." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "The Duke of Ashgrove is dead, Constance. Everyone knows that. His son inherited the title 18 months ago, Constance said, along with considerably less of his sanity than his father had. You'll manage. You've always been good at managing unpleasant men." That was as close to a compliment as Constance had given her in 9 years, and it was somehow the cruelest thing she'd ever said. Because everyone in London had heard the stories about the new Duke, how the fire that killed his father had left him scarred beyond recognition, how he hadn't set foot in society since, how the last woman his family tried to match him with had broken the engagement within a week of meeting him and refused to this day to say why. Eleanor's younger stepsister, Marguerite, appeared in the doorway, twisting the lace of her sleeve. "You're really going? To marry a man nobody's even seen?" "Someone has to," Eleanor said, folding a single traveling dress into a case that had belonged to her mother. "And it was never going to be you, was it?" It wasn't bitterness, it was fact. Marguerite was soft in a way the world hadn't yet tried to break, and Eleanor had spent a decade making sure it stayed that way. Even as she used up every reserve of her own softness doing it, she latched the case and did not look back at the house on her way out. The road to Ashgrove took 3 days, and with every mile the country got wilder. Hedgerows giving way to stone walls giving way to nothing at all but heather and gray sky and the occasional ruin of something that used to matter. Eleanor used the time the only way she knew how. She planned. If the Duke was cruel, she would learn his patterns and stay out of his path. If he was mad, she would learn which version of him to speak to and which version to avoid. She had survived Constance for 9 years by becoming an expert in the architecture of difficult people. A duke, she reasoned, could not possibly be more complicated than a woman who kept ledgers of other people's debts to her like they were love letters. What she did not plan for, what no amount of preparation could have accounted for, was the letter tucked into the lining of her own travel case. A letter she hadn't packed. A letter in handwriting she didn't recognize, sealed with the Ashgrove crest, addressed simply, "To be opened only after you have seen his face." She turned it over in her hands for the better part of an hour before she made herself put it away, unopened. Whatever it said, she decided, she would need her composure first. The castle appeared on the horizon like something that had survived a war it hadn't won. Half of it stood proud and gray against the sky. The other half was blackened stone and empty window frames, the scar of the fire still visible from a mile out. He did not come to greet her in the courtyard, which she expected. What she did not expect was the note waiting in her chambers instead, written in a hand that was surprisingly elegant for a man society called a monster. "Dinner is at 8. I will not require you to look at me if it troubles you, Most people prefer not to. There was something underneath the bluntness of it. Not self-pity exactly. Something closer to a man who had already decided how the story would go and was simply saving them both the trouble of pretending otherwise. At 8, Eleanor walked into the dining hall with her spine straight and her expression arranged into the practiced neutrality she'd worn through 9 years of Constance's dinners. She had told herself she was prepared for whatever damage the fire had done. She was not prepared for the scars to matter so little the moment he actually spoke. "You're not what I expected," said Duke Rhys Ashgrove, rising from his chair. The firelight caught the left side of his face. The burn scarring ran from his jaw to his temple, pale and rope-like against otherwise sharp features. He made no attempt to turn his good side toward her, the way she suspected most people in his life had learned to let him do. "Neither are you," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Sit, eat. We'll discuss terms after." The terms, as it turned out, were nothing like what she'd braced for. He didn't want an heir immediately. He didn't want a hostess for parties he had no intention of throwing. He wanted, he said flatly, someone who could run an estate that was hemorrhaging money while he dealt with matters he wasn't prepared to explain yet. And he'd chosen her specifically, he said, from a list of 6 candidates his solicitor had drawn up. "Why me?" Eleanor asked. "I have no dowry, no connections worth having. My own stepmother called me a burden at breakfast the day the contract was signed." Rhys studied her for a long moment. "That's not the question you should be asking." "Then what is?" He didn't answer. He simply refilled her glass and changed the subject, and Eleanor understood, the way she understood most things, by watching rather than being told, that she had just found the first thread of something he wasn't ready to give her yet. The weeks that followed did not unfold like the ruin she'd been warned about. Rhys was not mad. He was exhausted, the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had spent 18 months holding together an estate, a title, and his own composure with nothing but stubbornness. Eleanor recognized it instantly because she'd spent 9 years doing the same thing in a house that never once thanked her for it. She found him at 2 in the morning, asleep at his desk with his cheek against an open account book, a candle guttered down to nothing beside him. The steward's numbers didn't balance. Hadn't balanced in months, she realized, flipping back through the pages while he slept. And Rhys had clearly been trying to find the error alone, night after night, rather than admit to anyone that he couldn't. She didn't wake him. She pulled a chair beside his and worked through the ledger herself by the light of a fresh candle, and by dawn, she'd found it. The steward had been paying a supplier who didn't exist. When Rhys woke with a stiff neck and found the error circled in her small, careful hand, he said nothing about it for 2 days. On the 3rd, he simply started leaving the ledgers on the corner of her writing desk instead of his own. The bridge on the eastern road had been out since before the fire, and the tenant families on that side of the estate had been walking 2 miles out of their way for 2 years because no one had thought to mention it needed fixing. Eleanor mentioned it. Rhys stared at her like she'd told him something in a language he'd forgotten he spoke. "You just ask them," he said. "The tenants, what they needed. Someone should have. No one has, not since my father." He looked for a moment, less like a duke and more like a man who'd been trying to hold up a house by himself for so long, he'd forgotten there was such a thing as another pair of hands. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there in the mud with her, looking at a bridge that didn't exist yet, and something in his face had gone quiet in a way that wasn't sad. It was after the bridge that she started catching him watching her. Not with suspicion, not even simple attraction, though there was that too. Something closer to recognition, like he was checking her against a memory she had no part of. One evening in the library, she finally asked him outright, "You keep looking at me like you already know me." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "There's a letter, in your case, from my sister." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "You knew about that?" "I wrote it with her before she died," he said. 2 years ago, before the fire. She made me promise that if I ever needed to marry for the estate's sake, I'd choose someone who fit a very specific list of qualities. Not beauty, not birth. She was very firm about that. He looked at the fire, not at her. "You matched every single one." Eleanor's hands went cold around her teacup. "What was on the list?" "Read the letter," he said. "I'm not ready to say it out loud yet. Not until I know you'll still be standing here when I do. She didn't read it. Not that night, not the next week. Some part of her was afraid that whatever was inside would either be too small to matter or too large to survive. And either way, she'd built something with Reese in those quiet months that she wasn't ready to risk on a dead woman's checklist. Then Constance arrived, uninvited, in a carriage still splattered with mud from the London road, with Marguerite in tow and a fresh set of debts trailing behind her like smoke. "I've come to discuss the remainder of the settlement," Constance announced in the entry hall, peeling off travel gloves finger by finger, as though she hadn't sold her stepdaughter to a stranger 9 months prior and simply moved on. There were additional expenses the original contract didn't account for. Eleanor felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. The old, practiced stillness she'd used for 9 years to survive this exact woman. She could smell Constance's perfume from across the hall, orange water gone slightly sour with travel sweat, and it turned her stomach in a way the woman's actual words hadn't managed to do in years. Before she could speak, Reese stepped between them. "There's no remainder?" His voice was low, not loud, lower than she'd heard it, which was somehow worse. "Say another word about a settlement in my house, and I will personally see to it that every creditor in London knows exactly how you fund your daughter's wardrobe." Constance's composure cracked, not dramatically, just a small tightening around her mouth, the first genuine expression Eleanor had ever seen cross her face that wasn't calculated in advance. "You don't understand what she is, what she was raised to." "I understand what she survived," Reese said. "Get out of my house." Constance left without another word, spine still perfectly straight, and somehow that was worse than if she'd shouted. It meant she'd already recalculated, already moved Eleanor into some other column of her ledger and closed the book. Marguerite lingered a moment in the doorway, looking at Eleanor with something that might, for the first time, have resembled genuine regret, and then she was gone too. That night, alone in her chambers, hands shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with fear anymore, Eleanor finally opened the letter. The letter was from Reese's sister, Isabel, written in a careful looping hand 2 years before the fire that killed her. It wasn't long. Isabel had never been a woman who wasted paper. "Reese, you'll do this the stubborn way or not at all. So here's the only instruction I'll give you. Find the one nobody else wanted, not because it's noble, because she'll be the only one who knows what this family is actually worth, having never been handed anything by it. You'll know her by what she doesn't ask for. I love you. Stop grieving me and go find her." That was all. No list, no qualities laid out like a shopping order. Eleanor read it 3 times, waiting for more, and there wasn't any more, just a dead woman's impatience with her. Brother's grief, and 6 words that had apparently been enough to end up here, in this house, with this man. She found Reese in the library where he always was when he couldn't sleep. She didn't say anything at first, just held the letter out. He read it standing up, and she watched something move through his face that he didn't try to hide from her. Not this time. "That's it," he said, not quite a question. "That's it. I built a whole—" He stopped, ran a hand down his face, over the scars, the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. "I told myself there was a list. Qualities. Something I could point to and say, 'See, this is why. This makes sense.'" He looked at the letter again, like it might have changed. "There wasn't a list, Eleanor. There was one sentence and my own sister betting I'd know it when I saw it." "Did you know it?" "The first night. At dinner." He almost laughed, and it came out rough, more air than sound. "You looked at my face and didn't flinch and didn't perform not flinching either. You just ate your dinner. I've had 6 months to find a cleverer reason than that. There isn't one." By the following spring, Ashgrove Castle no longer looked like a ruin waiting to finish collapsing. The East Wing had been rebuilt. The tenant farms were solvent for the first time in a decade. And in the walled garden, Isabel had designed years before she died, Eleanor sat with a hand resting on the curve of her own stomach, watching Reese argue cheerfully with the head gardener about rose varieties. His scarred face turned fully toward the sun without a trace of the man who used to keep it hidden. Constance had sold her for £40,000, believing she was discarding a burden. She had, in fact, handed a broken man exactly the kind of wife his own sister had spent her last years hoping he'd find. and given a woman who had never once been chosen the thing she needed most, someone who had chosen her before he even knew her name. "Are you happy?" Reese asked later, joining her on the garden bench, his hand finding hers the way it always did now, without hesitation. Eleanor looked at the rebuilt walls, the garden in bloom, the man beside her who had spent a year proving that the worst thing that ever happened to her was, in the end, the door to everything she actually deserved. "I stopped counting the ways this could go wrong months ago," she said. "I think that means yes." That's the story of Eleanor and Reese. Proof that sometimes the cruelest transaction in someone's life ends up being the one that finally sets them free. If this kind of slow burn, redemption arc, historical romance is exactly your kind of story, hit like and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss the next one. See you in the next story.